For the watercolor stretch and explore, there's going to be a couple things that you're going to grab out. First thing is going to be the strip of paper that we're going to look at for the techniques itself. With this one, we're going to look at 8 to 10 techniques depending on if you do the optional ones. And then you also want to grab one of the watercolor palettes. These are going to be over by the sinks on the counter. You're also going to want to grab your set of brushes. We'll grab the green brushes out of here. Those are going to be your set that are for watercolor. For those of you that have new brushes that haven't been used yet, these come with an adhesive in them that really stiffens them up. So if you're noticing that they're really just like crunchy, get them rinsed out before you start painting. And then I would also say grab one of the blue brushes for the splatter technique. It works out a little bit better since the bristles are a little bit more snappy, whereas the watercolor brushes have a tendency to not work as well with the splatter technique. You're also going to grab a small piece of painter's tape, white crayon, and then for the painter's tape, I would say grab just about 1 to 2 inches. And then the salt for the technique, you're just going to grab a little bit of this. I would say you could even share this at your table too. I would say if you want to grab a little piece of scrap paper, just fold it up and then just get it in the middle. Use it at your table, and then once you're done with it, just get it thrown away. And then we'll also grab a thumbtack if you're doing the optional sgraffito technique, and then if you're doing the rubbing alcohol technique, the caps and the rubbing alcohol are going to be over on my desk. And then with that one, you're just going to grab kind of 1 squirt from that pipette. Usually doesn't take too much on that technique, so just that like kind of 1 squeeze will do just fine. And then as you get everything set up, kind of same thing as when we looked at the tempera paint, I would say work within your handedness. So if you are left-handed, have your watercolor paper centered, have your palette, paper towel, and water to that side of your handedness. So I'm gonna have that on the left side. If you're right-handed, switch that over. And then just helps kind of avoid having where you accidentally drop paint or water on your paper as you go back and forth. And then it helps just kind of avoid fatigue so that your wrists aren't straining as much to reach over your area. And then once you're all set up, then what we're going to do is we're just going to start to get the paint activated. With this, I would say just take your larger watercolor brush, drop a little bit of water in each of the colors you think you'll use. With this, we want to just saturate those colors up. And then as those saturate, then we can start to bring those colors over into the lid, starting to mix out those different shades that you want. And then moving into the techniques, the flat wash is kind of the easiest. It's going to be just kind of straight, solid wash of color, thinking just kind of solid one color all by itself. If you do have some that pools, you can go back and either remove it or you can move it around as well too. The next technique will be graded wash. This is thinking same thing, looking at color application. With this one, instead of it being solid, you're instead going to gradiate or alter it. This can either be from one color into another. It can also be one color to white or one color to black. And then with this, if you're going to white, you're just going to gradually include more and more water to get that transition. If you're going from one color to another, you're going to essentially start with that base color and then add more and more of that second color to gradiate and shift that shade over. The next technique that we're going to look at is going to be thinking on how we can mask off areas of the composition. So this is going to be looking at a crayon mask. With this, you're going to apply crayon to the paper. The wax is going to resist the watercolor, and you're going to be left with a design underneath. The crayon method, you can use this either on the white of the paper. You can also have a base color resist and then go back over. Something to keep in mind is you do want to use really heavy pressure when you draw with that crayon. If it's really light, it doesn't work as well. And you really want to have that worked back and forth into the paper so that it doesn't fill in. And then with this one, you're just going to go over with your watercolor. You'll notice that as you apply that, that the wax is going to push that paint away and you're going to be left with a design that you drew on. The next technique is going to be another masking technique, this time with tape. So you're going to take that 2-inch piece of painter's tape, you're going to cut or rip it up into a design, and then you're going to apply that tape to the paper. With the tape, make sure that it's fully sealed down to the paper. Once you have that fully sealed down, you're going to paint over the top. And then with the tape method with watercolor, you do want to leave it until it is completely dry. So don't remove it. Wait till that's completely dry. I think I left mine even overnight, so you can leave it for quite a while to let it dry up. The next technique is going to be dry brushing. This is pretty much how it sounds. You're going to get your brush as dry as possible, and then using a very small amount of paint, you're going to brush that on. It's going to give you a rougher, kind of more free, hairy texture where you're really seeing more of that individual brush stroke. Can be a nice one, especially as you layer in on base colors, starting to incorporate more texture. And then next technique is going to be wet on wet. So with this one, you're going to apply just water. And then once you have that water down on your paper, you're going to drop in bits of paint to essentially let it float and bloom around that area. This can be a nice, really uncontrollable technique. This is a nice one too, where you do get the kind of the nice blooming effect that people really like with watercolor, so it can be one to experiment with quite a bit, and it's usually one that's pretty enjoyable, and one that you can play around with. The next technique will be looking at splatters. So with this one, you can either load your paintbrush up with paint and then kind of tap it either on your wrist or your other hand, letting that paint apply. This one's can be nice where you want kind of more controlled, usually larger splatter. If you want finer splatter, you can also take it and just kind of flick it with your finger as well too. It's a little bit more messy. And then the next technique is going to be looking at salt. Salt is a nice additive that you can use with watercolor. It creates kind of the speckly, almost like starburst effect. The one thing with salt is that you do want to do it as soon as you apply your watercolor. It often has a tendency to work with lighter colors or colors that are diluted down with water a little bit more, but you do want to apply that salt as soon as you can. Usually the wetter the paint, the better the reaction that you're going to get on the paper. And then the next two techniques kind of go hand in hand. With these, you're thinking purposeful removal of paint. This can happen both wet and dry, and I'll kind of show you the differences between those. First one is going to be looking at lifting off with paper towel. So as you apply your paint, while it's still wet, what you can do is take a small piece of dry paper towel, and then you're going to essentially blot off this area that you'd like. This can be a nice way to remove excess paint. It can also be a good way to include purposeful texture. Sometimes people use this technique, especially for like clouds. You can also do this with your brush as well too. Usually with a brush, this is a little bit better where you have those smaller mistakes. Can also be a nice way to kind of lift off some of that value, especially if it's a little too dark. And then like I mentioned, you can also do this technique once it's dry. I'll do that at the end once everything dries up all together. And then first optional technique for you is going to be looking at using alcohol. This is another additive that you can use while the paint is still wet. Same thing, you're going to apply a wash of paint first, and then while that paint is still wet and active, you're going to, I usually just use the handle side of my paintbrush, the end, to apply the alcohol over top. It ends up essentially pushing the water away and creates can be a nice effect as far as creating like polka dots. Can also just be a nice textural inclusion as well too. And then last optional technique is going to be sgraffito. This is going to be where you're going to use that thumbtack. You're going to initially essentially etch a design into your paper using that needle to mark it in. Once you have that marked in, then you're going to go over with a wash of paint. This can be a nice one where if you use a darker color, it usually applies a little bit better. You'll wash over the top, typically removing some of the excess, and then the paint is going to seep down into those scratch marks, creating that design that will appear. And then coming back to the lifting off techniques, once that paint dries, you can go back. So with a paper towel, you're going to dampen the paper towel and then essentially blot off the paint. This is going to create a more rigid shape. You're going to see more of a distinct outline. Same thing with the brush technique. You're going to apply just water. Usually let it sit for a couple moments and then remove that excess water, and it's going to pick off some of the paint. Same thing, it's going to be a little more distinctive. It's going to give you a much more clear outline. Can be a nice way to show kind of either different patterns or different effects where you do want kind of more intentional shaping. And then once you're all finished with these, we'll let it dry up. For cleanup, you can just take your brushes. Usually if you just rinse those out in that jar of water, that's fine. You're going to bring that jar of water over to the sink, dump that out and get it returned. I would say use your paper towel, remove as much of the excess paint as you can. You can also get it a little bit of damp with some of the excess water, get that paint removed. Ends up being really helpful just to keep these nice for everybody. The tape, if you have a lot of extra, leave it in your storage. You can use it later for the project. If not, just toss it. And then make sure the crayon, thumbtack if you use that for sgraffito, the lid for alcohol, salt all gets taken care of and returned. And then once cleanup's all taken care of, I would say get your watercolor technique strip in your storage. We'll come back to it tomorrow and get the tape removed and peeled off, and then get this ready for hand in. As you get this returned, make sure that you do get your name on it somewhere, either on the front or back side is fine. And then just make sure that you are testing out at least those 8 techniques of the flat wash, graded wash, crayon and tape mask, wet on wet splatter, dry brushing, salt, and then the lifting off with paper towel and paint. The alcohol and sgraffito will be optional, so you don't have to do those if you don't want to. And then last note for you, the salt technique, once that is fully dry, I would say just kind of rub it with your fingers and then you can get that removed. You can also use, we have some of the frisket removers as well too over by Watercolor. You can try those out as well. But that should be everything. Holler if you have questions.